Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another deck profile. Today is going to be a Magic World deck featuring the brand new archetype that's going to be releasing in S-BT07 called Phantom Thieves Draco. Phantom Thieves Draco is a very interesting deck in which it's kind of like a control, draw, and mill deck. What Phantom Thieves is all about is putting as many treasures on your opponent's side onto the field as possible, and they do that by putting spells that they play into treasures and by milling essentially their top deck with the Buddy spell and by using Harry, the boss monster's ability to look at the top four and put two of them into there and then bottom the other two. There's a whole bunch of different ways of gaining treasure, and the deck is focused around gaining as much treasure as you possibly can. The important thing is just getting treasures. As the Buddy, we're running Castle in the Sky of Draco Phantom Thieves. So what this card does is, because it's a spell, it doesn't hit the field, so you don't get the Buddy gift from it, but this is the first time a spell can be used as a Buddy. And what it does is, if this is your Buddy and your flag is Magic World, you can only cast Phantom Thief Draco cards. And then whenever the opponent casts a spell, they would put it, instead of going into the drop, into basically their set spell zone as a magical treasure. And then when you cast this card, if this is your Buddy, you get to put up to 4 cards of the top of your opponent's deck into their spell area and they become magical treasures. And then you can only cast this once per turn. It's just very efficient at gaining treasures and making it so whenever your opponent casts a spell, you gain more treasures. Next, we have our big boss monster, Splendid Phantom Thief Wins Harry. So Wins Harry is the key card of the deck next to the spell, and because his call cost is pay 1 gauge, put the top card of your deck into its soul, then he has a counteract ability. During each player's attack phase, you can pay 1 gauge. If you do, draw a card, then look at the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck, put 2 among them into your opponent's spell zone as treasures, and bottom the rest. And then he's got move, double attack, and soul guard. He's just a very solid card at gaining treasure and drawing you more cards, and he's got double attack and move, so he can act as like your protection. He's basically everything the deck really wants to do. Next, we have Peerless Phantom Thief Mon Akwin. So when this card enters the field, you could drop a hand card. If you do, put up to 1 monster with Harry in its card name or 1 Phantom Thief Draco item from your deck into your hand, and then shuffle your deck. Just that first part, he is acting as your Harrier item search card, which the item is very good. I'll get to that later. And then he has his own counteract ability. Counter, during each player's attack phase, you can return this card from your field to your hand. If you do, call a size 2 or greater Phantom Thief Draco from your hand by paying its call cost. So not only does he fish for Harry, if you have like a full board formation, he could bounce himself back and you could play Harry during the attack step. Or if you want to use Harry more defensively, then you could also call Harry during your opponent's turn. Next, we have 4 copies of Elusive Phantom Thief Phantomaria. You can only call this card once per turn. When this card enters the field, if you have another Phantom Thief Draco on your field, put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge and draw a card. Then if your opponent has 2 or more treasures, you draw another card. And then if your opponent has 4 or more treasures, this card gains triple attack. He's just a very efficient way at gaining gauge, drawing cards, and on top of that, when he gets triple attack, he can hit for a lot of potential damage. Then we have 1 copy of the size 3 Polymorphic Phantom Thief 20 Fani. So its call cost is put 1 or more Phantom Thief Dracos from your field into its soul and pay 2 gauge. Counter, if a magical treasure is on your opponent's field, you may call this card by paying its call cost. So you could call him at counter speed, which is pretty darn good. Then, if you have 4 more magical treasures are on your opponent's field, this card gets +2 crit. If they have 6, this card gets plus 10,000 power and defense. And if they have 8, this card gets quadruple attack. Then he's got move, counter attack, and soul guard. He's like the real beef of the deck. Like, he is the heaviest hitting card of the deck. We only run one of him just because there's so many other things that the deck wants to do that just attacking a whole bunch sometimes isn't always the best option. And he's a size 3, so he takes up all your board space. But he's still a very good card and like the alternate win con of the deck. Now onto the spells. There's a lot of spells. I'm running 4 copies of the Buddy spell because it's the Buddy spell. Even though we could only use it once per turn, we still want to see it as much as we possibly can, so that way we can try to generate as much treasures as we possibly can. Next, I run 4 copies of Fishing Shuffle. You can only cast this if there's a treasure on your opponent's field. Counter, rest a monster on your opponent's field. If there are 6 treasures on your opponent's field, rest all cards on your opponent's field. It's just a really solid defense spell at resting your opponent's stuff, which resting right now is very important. Next, I play 3 copies of Holy Magic. This is probably one of the best spells in the deck, if not the best spell in the deck. What it does is return 3 or more different spells from your drop zone back to your deck. If you do, put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge and gain 2 life. Then if you returned 6 or more, you can draw 2 cards. Then if you returned 9 or more, you deal 3 damage to your opponent. Then you can only cast it once per turn. The once per turn is the real reason why we're only running 3 of it. Not to mention, because it's recycling all of our spells, we don't necessarily need to have 4 copies to try to see it as much as often, because it can recycle itself back into the deck. It's just a really solid spell at gaining gauge, drawing cards, and dealing a little bit of burn damage all at the same time. Next, I run 3 copies of Steal Time, We Say Goodbye. You can only cast this during your turn, then counter if there are 2 or more treasures on your opponent's field. Put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge. If there are 4, draw 2 cards. If there are 6, you gain 2 life, and if there are 8, you deal 2 damage. So it's kind of like Holy Magic, except the condition isn't returning spells, it's just your opponent controlling a whole bunch of different treasures. It's still a very solid and efficient way to gain gauge and dig through your deck, and gain some life and deal a little bit of extra damage. Next, I run 3 copies of Nice One. So Nice One is your just easy pay 1 gauge, draw 2 cards. You can only use it once per turn. So just more draw. Next, I run 3 copies of My Funny Venus. It's a set spell. All Phantom Thief Dracos on your field can't have their abilities nullified. When a treasure is put onto your opponent's field, you basically get to charge and draw. And then you can only have 1 copy of My Funny Venus set on your field at a time. So the reason why I run 3 of this is because you really want to see it as much as possible, and the deck has ways of discarding some cards, so even if you see multiple copies of this card, you could always just discard the copy or gauge the copy after you draw a card during your charge step. It's not necessarily dead seeing more copies of this, because there's ways of getting it into your grave, or if they destroy it, then you have an extra copy to set the set spell again. So it's just a very good card for Phantom Thieves, and having their abilities not be nullified is very important because you always want to try to get your abilities off. Next, I run 2 copies of Waltz of Harry. You can only cast this card during attack on your opponent's turn. Cast cost is return a Phantom Thief Draco monster from your hand and pay 1 gauge. Nullify the attack, then if your opponent has 6 or more treasures, reduce all damage you would take by 3. That's just statically for the turn. Any instance of damage you take is reduced by 3 if your opponent has 6 or more treasures, on top of which you're nulling the attack and putting a Phantom Thief Draco back into your hand so you could use it again in the next turn. Next, I run 2 copies of Sephirot's Lecture. You can only cast this during your turn. Look at the top 2 cards of your deck and put 1 of them into your hand and put the rest in your gauge. Next, I run 2 copies of Chronos Bayonet Agar. In this deck, you just pay 1 life and draw a card. That's basically it. Since we're not playing Time Dragons, the reverse part doesn't necessarily matter, but all we're doing is playing it as a different spell, and it's just paying a life and drawing a card. The deck already has a couple of different ways of gaining life back. Paying a life isn't that big of a deal. Next, I run 2 copies of Loyalty. Loyalty, again, it's one of those staples that kind of goes into every deck at this point. You pay 1 gauge, you choose one of the following. Most of the time, you're just going to choose the third option to shut down your opponent from calling more than their third monster, but its other abilities, such as reducing the next damage you take by 2 or dropping a soul, is also very good and has its own utilities. Next, 2 copies of Buddy Block, pay 1 gauge. Again, one of those defense staples. You're mostly going to be using it for its last ability out of the 2, which is if your opponent attacked 4 or more times, you just don't take damage from their attacks. It's just, again, a very solid defense spell. Next, I run 2 copies of Recover Veil. This is just your anti-discard card of the deck. You're most of the time not really going to be playing it unless you see your second Recover Veil. Most of the time, what I found myself doing is I'll hold on to Recover Veil. When I draw my second Recover Veil, I'll just use it to just gain 2 gauge for free. The defense part can matter, but most of the time I just found myself using it to charge 2 and to put another spell into my drawback counter speed, so that way my Holy Magic is a little bit more efficient and I'm gaining gauge. Next, I run 1 copy of No Pain, No Gain. Paying 2 gauge is probably the worst part about the card. We do have a lot of ways of gaining gauge, but the deck also uses a lot of gauge. This card, even though it's really good by drawing 2 cards and discarding a card from your hand, paying 2 gauge is kind of a lot, which is why I'm only running 1 of this. But it's still a very good draw card, and it's another different spell. That way, Holy Magic has another potential target. As far as the items, I'm only running 2 Chaser Beetles just because I can search it out. But what it does is you pay 1 gauge and pay 1 life to equip it. If there are 4 more treasures on your opponent's field, and all Phantom Thief Dracos can't be destroyed or returned to hand by your opponent's card effects. If there are 6 or more treasures on your opponent's field, all Phantom Thief Draco cards on your field basically get Shadow Dive. Then it has double attack. So the Shadow Dive part's very important because it helps bypass a lot of defenses. So if the opponent doesn't have like good defense spells, but they're relying solely on like a good defensive board, then Chaser Beetle just basically allows you to go and bypass all of their onboard defenses and attack their life directly, which can help in a lot of different situations, and getting treasures is not very hard at all. And then lastly, for the impact, we run 2 copies of Lullaby of Steam Sky. You can only cast this if you've attacked 2 or more times and you have a Phantom Thief Draco on your field. Its cast cost is to destroy as many treasures on your opponent's field as you want and pay 2 gauge, then deal damage to your opponent equal to the number of treasures that you paid for its cost. It just turns all of your opponent's treasure into damage, so if they can't mitigate that damage, this card can deal a lot of damage very quickly for a very low cost. The only downside is if you can't finish off your opponent with this impact, then it becomes a lot harder for you to reset and get a whole bunch of treasures again. Once you have a whole bunch of treasures, it's usually easy to keep and maintain that, but once you lose all of those treasures, then the deck becomes really hard to build them back up because you already spent so much time and resources putting all of it into this to begin with. So I only found myself ever casting this if I knew 100% I would be killing them with just the sheer amount of damage that this card can do. So that's it for the main deck. I do have a side deck built. So the side deck is going to pertain of just a lot of tech cards for the deck. So in my side, I run 2 copies of Fake Out. You can only cast this during your opponent's turn. Put a spell from your drop zone to the bottom of your deck, and then nullify an attack and draw a card. So this is just another defense spell. It also draws us a card, and it basically replaces the spell count in our drop zone by putting another spell back, but it could also be beneficial because if you have multiple copies of the same spell, then it is actually increasing our different spell count. Next, I run 2 copies of Buddyfighters Without Limits. This is a very good answer to Hand Hate. It could be used in all flags, and then when you were to drop a hand card, you just drop this card instead and you draw 2 cards. So it's a little bit different than Recover Veil. In Recover Veil, you don't drop it, and with Buddyfighters, you do drop it and you just draw more cards, which again is what the deck is really doing. And then you get to choose one of the following 2 if you choose to cast this. So you could either gain 3 life, or for this turn, give a monster a -2 crit. Both of those are just very solid defensive options. The deck sometimes can get a little low on life, and if you don't see the right cards in the right order, gaining life might be a little bit difficult. Just the gaining 3 life part's very good, and then cards with multi-attacking like triple, quadruple, or sometimes even double attack with high crit, like minusing 2 crit is just a very good effect in general. Next, I run 2 copies of Begone. So Begone is the call cancel for monsters that are size 2 or less. Pay 2 gauge, counter, you can only cast this card when your opponent is calling a size 2, and then nullify the call. So this helps in certain matchups where you know the deck is going to be like a size 2 or 1 primarily focused deck. So this just really helps in those kinds of matchups, and against like size 3 decks, this card really doesn't do much, which is why it's in the sideboard. But against the matchups it's good in, it's really good in. Next, I run 2 copies of Abracadabra. This is the spell canceller. Pay 2. You can only cast this card when your opponent is casting a spell. Nullify that spell that the opponent is trying to cast. Next, I have 1 copy of Great Spell Circle of Deity Dragon. This is another set spell. We don't care about the first part, but what we do care about is the second part. At the start of your opponent's turn, choose a spell in your drop zone. You may drop a hand card. If you do, put the chosen spell into your hand. This is just a really good tech card at recycling spells that you've already used. And then lastly, 1 copy of Warrior in the side. You can only cast this card if you have 3 or more spells in your drop zone. Counter, return a card from your opponent's field to the hand. This is just a bounce spell, but it's a really efficient bounce spell. Most of the time you're going to be using it either on their set spell or item, because most of the time their field's going to have a whole bunch of different forms of protection. If it doesn't, cool, this card's even better. If it does, again, most of the time you're just going to target the set spell or the item, because that's most of the time what's going to be causing a lot of the forms of protection. Now, I do have a couple of different options of a couple of their cards that you could run. You could run Taraka Lee, pay 1 gauge, pay 1 life, counter, choose one of the following 2. You're never going to use the Dragon part, so you're only going to ever use it to rest up to 2 cards on your opponent's field. Again, just another solid defense spell if you really want to. It rests and it doesn't nullify the attack, so that could be very important. You could also run Time Sale. Your life can get pretty low at times. When this card is free, it's very good, but otherwise, pay 2 gauge, pay 2 life, and draw 2 cards. Just a very simple spell that just does what the deck wants and draws you more, and it's another different spell for your different spell counts for Holy Magic. You could also run Gentleman Phantom Thief. If a treasure is on your opponent's field, the size of this card is reduced by 1. So this is one of the few cards that can be a size 0 in the deck. Then, when this card attacks and destroys an opponent's monster or deals damage to an opponent, if a treasure is on your opponent's field, you can return this card from your field to the hand. If you do, drop one of your opponent's gauge and deal 1 to your opponent, and your opponent chooses to drop a hand card. This is a really good way of disrupting the opponent. You could also run Trio. Trio is a good card in which you pay 1 gauge, pay 1 life, put a monster from your drop zone back into your hand. The deck is really reliant on Harry, so if Harry is in your drop zone, this is probably the best way of getting a Harry outside of trying to draw more, or if any of your monsters are in the drop, this is just a very effective way of getting them back out of the drop into your hand. You could run Sweet Happy Time. This is just another one of those staples where it's very effective at doing its multiple different modes. For 1 life, you get to choose one of the following 3. Either all monsters on your opponent's field get minus 10,000 defense. That part doesn't matter so much because you're trying to give them all Shadow Dive anyway to attack through their center. But the other 2 effects kind of matter. During this turn, all monsters on your field can't be rested by opponent's card effects while you're trying to Shadow Dive through their center. If they have any rest spells, this makes it so they can't be rested. And then during this turn, the ability of monsters on your field can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects. If you don't have your set spell, that part can be good. It's just a very good utility card. The deck can run Lost World, just because it draws a lot and gains a lot of gauge. Lastly, you could run Tidia Effectus. You can only cast this card during an opponent's attack, and you have no monster in your center. You pay 1 gauge to nullify the attack. Then the next damage you take is reduced to 0. So again, just another defense spell option. Phantom Thieves Draco is a very fun deck. I enjoyed a lot of my testing with it. It can be a little bit complicated remembering all the triggers, and the deck does recycle itself through a lot. But if you wanted to, you could run more than the 50 cards, because a lot of the cards do just say draw a card, search for this, put the cards back, draw more cards. Going over 50 isn't the worst thing if you want to like splash in a couple more cards. So like I would probably cap it at about 55 if I had to go over. But overall, the deck is really fun. I think the deck is really solid. It's a very powerful deck, but it can get even more powerful if you, the player, understands like the meta of the game and the current state, because choosing, with Harry's ability specifically, choosing which cards to deny your opponent is the most important aspect of the deck, because allowing your opponent to get the cards that they need and you having the ability to somewhat mitigate that to a degree is very powerful, but it's only as powerful if you like know and can try to pick the right options. But outside of that, I definitely love the deck. I love the Phantom Thieves like vibe and theme, and I think the deck is going to be very, very good. So I hope you enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more Buddy Fight content, and I will see you in the next video.